Hi, and welcome to Fantasy Author Chat. I have with me today Tendai Huchu. Welcome, Tendai.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Oh, you're welcome. And you are in Edinburgh, Scotland at the moment, yes?
I am, and I'm at that stage in my life where this is the highlight of my weekend. So thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, truly. So I'm going to read a bit from your website and bio and all of that, and then we'll just dive right into some questions. So T.L. Huchu, he, him, or Tendai Huchu, has been previously published as Tendai Huchu in the adult market, but the Edinburgh Nights series is his genre fiction debut. His previous books, The Hairdresser of is it Harare
Yes, it is.
and The Maestro, The Magistrate and the Mathematician, I love that title, have been translated into multiple languages, and his short fiction has won awards. Tendai grew up in Zimbabwe but has lived in Edinburgh for most of his adult life. So I just have to I'm going to first give a rave. I'm not quite finished with Library of the Dead because I've been finishing a book and this is my reward. So now I'm diving back
You
in.
do that as well.
Yeah.
I sometimes when I'm writing, I have a novel with me that I use. Like when I wrote my first novel,
Yeah.
it was Independence by Sarah Manika, and so I would write a bit. Every time I hit like 5,000 words, I would then reward myself with a
Yeah.
chapter.
Yeah. So that's pretty much what I've been doing for the last couple of months, and I love this book so much. I'm obviously not finished, but I'm in a very harrowing part, and I there's such that strikes me on a personal level about the architecture of Edinburgh, but also seen through the lens of the architecture of grief. And that just hit me so hard in this, grieving my father who passed away 2 years ago, and like I recognized that fingerprint of grief that we have, and I just Ropa is amazing, an amazing character, and following Ropa through this book is you're in their thoughts, you're in their crises, you're in the memory, you're in the grief, and just trying to get through the day, just trying to make some money, help her family survive. But she's, I won't say defined by grief, but she is powerfully influenced by it, and I think that gives her a level of empathy with the ghosts that she encounters who want to connect with their loved ones again before they can pass on. So this is just on a personal level, this has struck a chord in me that nothing else I've read in the past 2 years has, and I thank you for that, just on a personal level. And it's just a
Thank
freaking
you.
great book. It's so great.
Thank you. That's very kind, and I'm sorry to hear about your dad. I mean, um, as writers, we often try to avoid cliches, but with these things, this is bigger than words. There is nothing anyone can say that can quite capture that feeling
Exactly.
or even soothe it in any meaningful way. So it's only I lost my mom in 2017, and I
Sorry.
kind of, yeah, at that stage, the library is dedicated to,
Yeah.
it's in her memory, and it is one of those strange things. I began to understand the power of some of these cliched things that we say to each other in those moments, some of these, the culture that we have around grief. But yeah, like they say, time passes. I've had it described as a sort of amputation, and yeah, it
Yeah.
hurts when it happens. Over time, you sort of missing a limb, and
Right.
there is that itch, that phantom itch that you get
Yes.
from time to time, and it
Yeah.
never goes away. But you do move on, and we grow from it.
Yeah. We
So
do.
yeah.
And then, I think like you, like, I know in Luminiferous, the fourth book of my series, some of that was already woven in uncannily, and then I was able to kind of feed in some grief there from that because I was writing that, after he had passed. And so I feel like it's hard for us to as writers to not interweave those parts of our lives, even if it's really subtle, right? But I think it's helpful. It's one of our ways of healing, you know.
It is, and this is sort of one of the reasons why. I mean, you're a reader, as am I. This is how we get started. in this particular field. And what got me into writing was when I was younger, reading stuff that captured feelings or ideas or emotions that I myself couldn't articulate, but finding them in someone else's work, it's immensely powerful. And this is why so many people still, I mean, you've got Netflix and the internet and all sorts of things going on now, but you still have a lot of people that gravitate to the written word because I think it's the only place that you can get that particular thing.
Yeah, I like to describe it as you enter a contract with the writer's mind. And, that's, like I said, the architecture of grief and the architecture of Edinburgh and the Library of the Dead are intertwined completely. And, the city as a character is a theme that I adore. And my first visit to Edinburgh was in June to Chimera Festival, where you were. And that's how I became familiar with your work. I had seen the book before, but I had never read it, so I grabbed it there. And I'm really glad I did. And I can't wait to read the sequel as soon as I'm done with this, too. Talk about rewards. But, I loved, this was like the best souvenir I could have got from Edinburgh because it's set there. You can see kind of the skyline, and I fell in love with that.
And you've seen those places.
I have seen those places, and I trampled all over it with Gareth L. Powell and Adrian Tchaikovsky. We had a big time. It was one of the most wonderful weekends of my entire life, and I was powerfully attached to that city in a way I hadn't been in decades. When I first laid eyes on San Francisco, I had a similar effect, and that would go on to change my entire life, that visit to San Francisco. Because I grew up in Tennessee, and I had not ever been in a city on my own. It was like my first adult experience, and what a city, right? To go on my own and visit, and it just was incredible. But in this regard, like Edinburgh, I could see it was already starting to change me, like before I even got on the plane to come back to LA. So thank you for being part of that journey for me. It's just fantastic. I'm just so happy that I found your work.
It's weird when you relate with someone and they've felt something that you felt as well, because I'm from a small mining town in Zimbabwe called Bindura, and moved to Harare, the capital, which you've mentioned, the hairdresser of Harare, which is the setting for my first novel. But when I moved to the UK about 20 odd years ago, I did a stint out in England for about 3 years, lived in London, lived in Reading, eventually moved over to Edinburgh for uni. Now, at the time, I just thought, you know what, Scotland is tiny. There's nothing going on there. I'll get my degree, move back down south where all the action is. And I remember coming into the city and just thinking, wow, what is this place like? You can't quite articulate it at the time. It's something that grows on you, and it keeps on building and building and building.
Yes.
There's this, it's such a writer's city, right? The Scots Monument.
Yeah.
The Writers Museum, all this history that's there, that's bound up to the written word. And I fell in love with the city. I thought I would leave, but here I am in 2022. I'm still here, and I'm writing about it.
That's pretty great. And who knows, like maybe we go our separate ways throughout the world, but that city's going to live with us forever, right? In more than just words, right? So, but I have to ask, at what point did you know you wanted to write urban fantasy? Because it's such a fantastic and broad field, in my opinion, of fantasy, even though it is a subgenre. And I want to hear about your journey with that.
Well, it's a weird one, because I start off in litfic,
Yeah.
But I've always sort of, even then, I've always sort of used elements of genre to buttress my, because what are we talking about when we talk about genre, right? I think it's just a tool in the writer's toolkit, for lack of a better word. So you want to tell a particular story. If you're really interested in science and thinking about the science, then sci-fi will be your thing. Or if you don't want to take it all the way there, then you've got something like Lablet, which is more grounded, maybe a little less speculative, but has more to do with how, the mundane day-to-day work of scientists living today. So you've got all these genre conventions that you can borrow from in order to tell a particular story.
Right.
And when I think about it now, obviously, because of the way the bookstores are arranged and the way books are marketed, genre becomes something that's really important. But if I think of an older writer like Dickens, how do you join up Great Expectations with A Christmas Carol or Tale of Two Cities? I mean, one is like a fantastic ghost story, and the other ones, maybe you'd consider them literary fiction. So there's a lot of writers that are like that. And for me, when a story comes to me, I'm always trying to think, okay, what's the best form for this particular narrative? I'm a gregarious reader. I read fiction across different genres and different styles. But I always think, okay, what is the best form we can package this in?
Yeah.
So I've been doing SFF and crime short stories because in my own writing practice, I do sort of like the lit fic, a bit of crime, and SFF. And I'd been working on all these stories because I look at the short form, which is legitimate in its own right, but I look at the short form as my R&D department.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If I have an idea, I want to test it out. Or a particular character. So in 2015, I published a story called Ghost Stoker, which was set in my hometown of Bindura in Zimbabwe.
Cool.
About a young girl who uses Mbira, to talk to ghosts. And I loved the voice and just how spunky the character was. But I didn't know whether I could pull off a novel with it.
Obviously, good.
A few years later, I did another story called The Library of the Dead, set in Harare, kind of exploring how we use... I'm one of those weird people that likes graveyards, going there, reading inscriptions.
Yeah.
Thank God I'm not the only one.
No, I mean, that's one of the reasons this had appealed to me, was because of that.
Yeah. And so they're really interesting spaces, and there's a lot of history contained in these spaces. And I did that particular story. I knew they were contained. I mean, they were in the same universe. But when I thought of doing a novel, now I had to figure out, okay, how do I join up these stories and these proto-characters that would later become Ropa and Jomo? How do I weave them into something a little bit more substantial called the novel? So initially I wanted to set it in my hometown, which is small. I mean, it's grown since I left, but I wanted a bigger canvas, and Edinburgh came to mind. It's the place that I know second best to my hometown.
Right.
But Edinburgh, as you've seen, it's a small city, right? It's not New York. It's not London. But what it lacks in terms of its speciality, it more than makes up for in the temporal depth of its history.
It does.
So now you have that urban setting, and you have the fantastic. And so automatically it becomes urban fantasy. But I think the work comes first, and then the genre emerges out of the work. I don't know if you find that with your own writing practice.
Yeah, I do. Because absolutely, it doesn't, like, for example, in the collection I've got coming out next year, The Shadow Galaxy, I have several genres of work, but several of them trip the lines of some of the other genres. So like one of them is gothic horror, but it's kind of cosmic horror, or one of them is fantasy, but it's kind of, there's a sci-fi twist at the very end that you don't see coming. And then one of them is sci-fi, but it's turns out to be a romance. So, there's like, I think that it's hard to just say, okay, it's this, when really it's a rainbow, right?
Yeah. And you need to be a reader to understand sort of like how to work best within that particular genre. And so in my particular case, I riffed off a lot. And thank goodness he hasn't yet sued me for plagiarism, but of Ben Aronovich's fantastic Rivers of London series. I mean,
Well, I haven't
if
read
you
that
want,
actually. So,
you've got to.
okay.
It's
Rivers of London.
incredibly
All right.
it's incredibly well done. And so I pinched some of the DNA from that particular series, but then tried to fit it sort of like to my own aesthetic preferences, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. Hmm. That's
Yeah. So now I'm an urban fantasy writer.
that's fantastic. And you've mentioned that being an influence, but I'd love to know what other influences you've had, like books, shows, films, or writers in general on your work.
My work, the influences vary over a period of time, and they have. When I started out, the thing that really got me into writing, I was crazy about 19th century Russian lit, Dostoevsky in
Yeah.
particular. I've said before to many people that I consider Dostoevsky to be the great Zimbabwean writer, because when you read his stuff, you get the sense that he is talking about the Zimbabwean situation. And this is a guy writing
Fascinating.
about 19th century Russia.
Yeah, but
And
still.
but still, yeah. So my first attempt at writing a novel was a god awful reworking of his novel called The Devils in a Zimbabwean setting. And at the time, I thought it was a work of monumental genius that would set the world alight. But yeah, it was really bad because I had to learn the craft, and I'm still learning the craft.
Yeah, we learn it constantly. Yeah.
So if you'd asked me that question maybe 10, 15 years ago, Dostoevsky would have been right up there. But
Fascinating.
over time, your influences start blurring. Even some authors that I've dissed in the past, right? And 10 years ago, again, when the Da Vinci Code was a thing, right?
Yeah.
And everyone was reading it, but I was reading also the reviews and the broadsheets, and everyone was. It's very fashionable to diss Dan Brown, right?
Yeah.
And they say stuff about his prose, etc., etc. And I was in that camp. But when I started my project, I looked back and thought there was one thing that he does better than everyone else, which is to bring history in a contemporary setting and create sort of like a chase or a quest around
Yes,
that.
he
You're
does.
not going to do any better than Dan Brown.
Yeah.
So there I am, riffing off an author that I used to diss in my youth. It's
We've all been there.
exactly. So you start finding that you pinch bits
Yeah.
and pieces from here and there, and it informs your own practice. So
Like cooking.
exactly like cooking.
Yeah.
So I have authors that I love, but some of the authors that I adore don't influence my own writing practice.
Exactly. Yes. Same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. And isn't that interesting? Because you would think, oh my God, I love this, but it's just not, it's sort of a Teflon skillet thing where it's not sticking to your writing. That's just pleasure and delight for you. And it's like a vacation from that. But and then others that you might not think are just sort of are sending out little tendrils into your mind that you didn't expect. So yeah.
Yeah. And it works in weird, funny ways.
Hmm.
So when you're younger, you go through this imitative phase, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have your own voice, you don't have your own style. You're trying different bits and pieces. But a good example, moving from literature is Tarantino, right? Every guy is into Tarantino and his ultra violent style of doing things. You can admire that, but if you try to do that, it's never going to work for you. Somehow it works for him,
Yeah.
but if you try to imitate that aesthetic, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I did have these things where I tried all these different things, but they didn't particularly work. I don't write anything like Dostoevsky, even though I admire his craft and what he did. So eventually you start finding yourself, but what you end up coming with is built on all these brilliant works that you've read in the
Right.
past. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, you know, bringing up Tarantino, like, I mean, he didn't start, you know, out of the ether. He was influenced by people. And I'm pretty sure he, like all of us, probably had his imitative phase, right? Where he tried different things and then found his voice. So we all have our unique voices. And that's what's so important as a writer and as a reader to recognize that it doesn't matter how big or small a name a writer is. It's a special voice for each unique work, and all readers should celebrate all writers, is kind of my feeling, no matter how big they are. And, you know,
Yeah.
that's been kind of the topic of discussion in publishing lately about, you know, advances and things like that. And I was like, that doesn't influence, no matter what an author gets, congrats, but it doesn't influence my view as a reader for how that story is going to affect me or if I want to read it. I'm just pleased that any writers write, no matter their publishing history, you know,
Mhm.
or path to that. So, because I feel like we're picking up those inner contracts. So, but I'm curious, you know, how much of your background, like, you know, when in your career, you know, how much of your background have you interwoven into your writing?
Yeah, that's a slightly trickier one because there is this saying, right, that's like all fiction is autobiographical and all autobiography is fictional. So in terms of myself, like the characters can't know anything that I don't know, but I do try to write characters that are a little bit smarter than I am. Roper being one. She's a smart kid.
She's awesome.
So it's stuff that I know, but in the past, I have had a crack at um, autofiction that didn't quite work for me as a form to work in, right? Because it it tends to be, I mean, you can get ground down in something that's like navel gazing, and it's like, yeah, fine, that's fascinating for me, but it's not fascinating for everyone else.
Right.
Because one of the things that I make peace with is the fact that at the other end of this is the reader. I'm a storyteller, you know, and the last thing, if ever you've been grabbed by a drunk friend and they've been particularly chatty on that particular day, and you're like, I don't want to be here. I'm not interested in anything, but they go in. You will know
Yeah.
what it's like
Yeah.
to read something from a writer who's not giving you, the reader, something in return. But there are bits and pieces for me, like in this particular work in the Library of the Dead, my own fascination for the Scottish Enlightenment, which is the
Yeah.
Scottish Enlightenment is this now long story. Scotland, pre, you know, the 18th century, Scotland was the poorest nation in Western Europe. It was, as Trump would call it, a shithole, right?
Yeah.
Um, and you know, they had famines, they had all sorts of like social, you know, economic problems. But an amazing thing happened sort of in the 18th century, post the union with England, when Scotland joins up sort of like in the English imperial mission, right? A great flourishing begins to happen in terms of science, literature,
Right.
theology, jurisprudence, anything to do with the modern world. There's a great book by Arthur Hammond called The Scottish Enlightenment, and he has also got another one called How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And for me, coming from a country that's like Zimbabwe is a former settler colony. So one of the ironies moving over to the UK is you begin to find a lot of stuff that you recognize, street names, place names. I mean, your education system is modeled on the British system. So
Yeah.
stuff doesn't surprise you, but you now like you've gone into, to use an Independence Day analogy, into the mothership, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is where this stuff comes from.
Yeah.
Um, And that's fascinating because this period really shapes the world that we live in
Hmm.
today.
Fascinating.
And so Ropa's world begins to mold around that. And one of the weird things that happens, for example, when I was trying to find sort of the entrance for my Library of the Dead, I was wandering around all these old graveyards around sort of like the old Carlton part of town.
Yes.
And I came into the old Carlton burial yard, right? So it's this graveyard that was originally intended for Jews, non-Christians, atheists, that kind of thing. They would get buried there
Oh, wow.
because you couldn't have them in the
Right.
Christian cemeteries. That was consecrated ground. So there's this nice round mausoleum that's there.
Hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, that's a great entrance. But who was buried there? David Hume, their philosopher. So that begins to influence,
Fascinating.
that begins to influence my magic system, right? For example, the society of the magical society in this book is called the Society of Skeptical Inquirers.
I love
Because
it.
then I was thinking of Hume's influence, skepticism, empiricism, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So my fascination with pop philosophy, pop science, pop psychology kind of weaves its way into the particular text. So you do give something of yourself, even some of the cultural references. I think when you go too far, though, and this has happened to me, there are bits where the editor has been like, nah, that is not the character. That's you popping
Oh,
into the
yeah.
text.
Well, that's a good editor who can recognize that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to find a way of kind of weaving your interests
Yep.
in into this particular thing. But I mean, my culture, I'm Zimbabwean as well. Ropa is kind of, she would be a second or third generation migrant.
Yeah.
So of course I had to start doing different things, like looking at my friends' kids and how they
How they're
speak,
doing. Yeah.
because I've had, I don't have any children myself. But my best friend, made me the godfather of his kids.
Oh,
So I noticed this thing that the kids do where they're pretty formal and correct when they speak with us, but when they go off with their mates, they code switch and they
right.
start speaking Scots. And I was like, okay, so I'm gonna have this character who does a lot of code switching through the text because
Smart.
this is how these kids experience their lives. So
Yeah.
you draw some of those things into your work, and hopefully it creates an interesting character that feels three-dimensional.
Oh, Ropa's like four-dimensional to me at this point. So, yeah, just an amazing character, and your style of reading is such that you see things unfold with Ropa that I don't normally see in main characters, and it's so nice because I feel like I am really living in her worldview. I'm there, and I don't know how you do it, but props. So that's all I got to say about
Thank you.
that.
it's
It's so
it's, it's
cool.
what I was trying to do is to have this character that you follow so closely. So, for example, in the world building,
Which is our next
I could have
topic,
done the
right?
conventional world
Yeah.
building that explains the world to the reader, but this is Ropa's reality.
Right.
So she just rattles stuff off. It's not a big deal. It's this, people have
I
described
love
it
it.
as a post-apocalyptic setting,
Yes.
but for her it's not a big deal because this is the world that
That's what
she
she grew
knows.
up in.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I'm trying to get the reader to experience the world through her eyes.
Right.
So your knowledge of the setting of this Edinburgh that I've created grows over time,
Yeah.
but you don't get that prologue that tells you why the place is the way it is in
Right.
an exact way. Yeah.
I love that, and I've done that myself more recently too. Where I don't want to hit people over the head with this sort of this is what happened. It's not there's no opening scrawl per se. You're in it. You're living there. And I mean, for me, it just makes it feel more lived in and things like that. And I think it's really interesting what you said too about the code switching and also about how, she's just used to that situation, which for other generations before her were extremely traumatic, right? To have this massive
Yep.
change. this cliff that they fall off of in society. For her, that's just what she knows. It's all she knows. And I was just literally thinking yesterday how my kids, the defining moment of their young lives so far has been the pandemic, and how that completely drastically changed, and it led to a diaspora for myself and my kids, and then back again, and then several other families I know. And then how, even though it's not as dire a situation, thankfully, but although it came close, and who knows, right? But for the
Yeah.
moment, it's not as dire a situation. But just to see that everything did sort of change for them, but at the same time, it was different for them because they were growing during it. And I don't know what it's going to be like for younger kids. Like, are they going to be like Ropa, that it's just like, well, this is just the way it's been. Whereas for us, it was like this massive, like, oh my God. And then like the sort of feeling of guilt too on some of, like, I wish my kids hadn't had to see this happen, because in my childhood, although we had the threat of like nuclear war, things like that. So there's that. And that's just what I grew up in. But then I wonder, what was it like for my parents? Were they going, oh my God, we've got these kids and suddenly the world literally can end. So it's a trip, and it's really interesting to see people just living that future. And I love that it's a theme. So, and then talking about world building, like, sorry, my chair is very creaky. It's like that spooky door in an old empty house. Anyway, so how do you approach world building? Like, how are you? You've mentioned, seeing that mausoleum was just like it all fell into place. Is that something that happens all the time with you, or how do you world build?
World building, in this particular sort of story that we're talking about, the city becomes a character in its own right.
Yes.
But the world building is also linked up to, the last question you asked, which is sort of about putting bits of yourself in the story.
Yeah.
And you've talked about your own experiences of sort of like the threat of nuclear war, that kind of thing. For me, growing up, the big thing is, so I'm born and raised in I was born in 1982, which is 2 years after Zimbabwe got its independence.
That's a big
Right, so there was a bloody civil war for us to get
yeah.
our independence, and so you've got this period of economic stability and optimism, certainly in the north of the country, where I was born and raised. But things start falling apart in the 90s when I become a teenager, and you can see, oh shit, the opportunities that were there and the freedoms that had been promised, and we kind of moving our way into a dictatorship,
Oh
pretty
God.
much, right? And with that sort of like economic upheaval comes sort of like political upheavals, violence, and all those other things. And so the world that you grew up in kind of recedes into this hyperinflationary nightmare, pretty
Mm.
much. It's an apocalypse. It's
Yeah.
an apocalyptic event that occurs. So my construction of Edinburgh, and people have said this is, it's a post-apocalyptic novel, but it's my version of Edinburgh as a third world city,
Yeah.
in which some things
Absolutely.
happen,
Yep.
the
Plumbing doesn't work well, like basic stuff doesn't work. Yeah.
yeah. So even as you read it, you can barely make sense of the currency that they use. It's not the British pound anymore.
Right.
But one of the reasons that I sort of did that was, again, let's go back to the history. Edinburgh is the poorest nation in Western Europe,
Yeah.
right? So when you walk through Edinburgh today, maybe your experience of it would have been this sanitized, quaint, touristy city. That's what it presents itself as the outside world. But when you learn the history, which is brutal and bloody, I mean, you go through the new town, which is kind of like the swanky bit with the gorgeous sort of like architecture, you realize that some of these buildings, were built with funds that these slave owners got from the abolition of slavery. So when I came into Edinburgh, again, I had that sanitized version of this beautiful kind of slightly classic Gothic city. But I met a friend called Lisa Williams that does these history walks through the city. And she'll walk through these spaces where you kind of realize that, okay, this is how we got this beauty and this art within the city. But the story that I'm creating, and this is the reason why sort of chapter 1 starts in this house up in Juniper Green where Thomas Carlyle, the famous historian, lived. Yeah. Because I was saying overtly to the reader, this is a history that I'm telling you through the form of this urban novel. And so there's been an unraveling. So with empire comes wealth, power, and prestige. Mm-hmm. But if you think about the world that we're living in now, I mean, one of the issues in modern Britain today, you've heard about Brexit and all that.
Right.
It's where are we after empire?
Yeah.
Right. Because Britain is used to being in the center of things, but now it's not. And it can't accept the idea that it becomes just a mid-rate European power. Okay. So this is one of the reasons, we violently separated ourselves from the EU, right? Because in the EU, you're just one among many. But there's almost this attempt
sort
through
of
maybe
to the edge, right?
Yeah.
A slow apocalypse.
Exactly. And now if you look at sort of the economic situation that we live in, it's pretty precarious, right? There's generations now that will not be able to have the same lifestyle their parents had. That's all gone.
Yeah.
No matter what they do. And it's not their fault.
Right.
So it's kind of, which is pretty much the same case. My own dad and mom, they grew up in the rural areas of Zimbabwe. They pretty much grew up in mud huts. My dad will tell you he went to school without shoes.
Right.
Became a metallurgist, worked his way into the middle class, could afford to send us to fine schools, ex-colonial schools that like Black kids couldn't go to when he was growing up, right? But when all this chaos happens in Zimbabwe, now, if I had kids, I couldn't give them the lifestyle that he gave me when I was growing up. So this is kind of the stuff that's playing out in this Edinburgh that I'm building. I'm looking at history. I'm looking at my own experiences. So it's a mess. It's the Edinburgh that I create is a hodgepodge. And that's why I'm very comfortable putting electric vehicles next to horse-drawn carriages.
Which I think is pretty realistic. That's exactly how it would go. And if you think about it, like, the remnants of past centuries, existing alongside us now, of course it's going to be like that. It seems very rich in tapestry, that very realistic to me that way. Disturbing, and that's why, because it's so plausible.
Yeah. And so through the world building, what I'm trying to do is to play around with time. Now, what you normally do when you're playing with time in the novel is you mess about with the chronology, of events, which is fine. But I'm using the geography of the city, to bring all these layers of time and to compress them into one and say, this is a 300-400-year-old story that is happening. So you can never quite tell what period the novel occurs in. People go around saying God save the king. So
right,
there is a king, Queen Elizabeth is gone. So it might be in the future. But you also have to recall that queens are pretty rare. You've got Elizabeth, Victoria,
extremely rare.
Elizabeth again. But most of the time you've got kings coming in.
Yeah. And that's how it will be going forward too,
Yeah. So does that make any sense?
Oh yes, it does, and it's so rich and interesting. I love it. So, gosh, so I mean, you've answered a lot of the questions that I thought about asking, and I love that because it feels like we were on the same track, thinking about this.
But then I'll ask you, in world building, having read Heliopause.
Thank you.
Again, one of the things I loved about Heliopause is you could have gone deep. You have a science background. You could have gone deep into explaining everything, say, about this space station they're in, but you left room to breathe. So in world building, how do you get that knack of what to tell the reader and what to leave out so that they can just infer it for themselves?
I think it's a personal choice. I wanted to keep, in this case, Heliopause, I wanted to keep it more lean. I wanted to keep it about the characters, not about how is Mandara Research Station powered, which I talk about a little. I drop hints that some of the actual power in the station comes from just literally walking around on these weird soft floors that Forrester hates. That's sort of generating power. But there's, like the gravitational situation. It does spin. It does have a spin. Things like that, and it's bottom deck because that's a top, mid deck, and bottom deck, and it's intentionally like shaped like a queen conch shell. So more or less. And I get into a little bit of that, and I know that I could have spent pages upon pages talking about that. I talk a little bit more about it at another time, but I don't dwell on it because I know it's not essential to the plot. And then I wanted people to focus on more of the fact that the heliopause is really freaking far out in space. So you already know it's decently far in the future. And this station is one of a few sprinkled out, on the outer reaches of the solar system, in much the same way the International Space Station prepares us for interplanetary travel and life. Mandara would prepare us for, extra solar system travel and life, on distant, where you have to have a sustained situation, a sustained place where you have, there's a conservatory, it grows, plants and things like that. They have limits on some of the things that they can have. There's no beer there, but you can have spirits, and so, I could and have on my own for notes written at length about all this stuff. And if one day people are like, I need to know more, then I could absolutely put that out there. But I just kept it lean. I wanted this team to be under duress. I wanted it to be far enough out that nobody could get to them fast, because that's a bad situation. And if it's something completely left field, like what happens here, like you would anticipate, like watching For All Mankind, for example, as an alternate history for the space program, like they still had to deal with real life and real situations of things going wrong, but at no point, at least not yet, they've not introduced some sort of entity that would come in and not be part of a contingency plan that you would have on this isolated station, right? You don't expect somebody to show up like, putting people in a place of permanent torture and keeping them alive and not knowing what the heck is going on or where it came from or what's going to happen next and could we stop it. So I just wanted that world building to be lean, but I also gave enough hints to let you see some fantastical things that let you understand that this is one possible path for us, but there is some exotic action going on. Whereas in the future, like in the sequel Ephemeris and the 3 sequels to Heliopause, this is a 4-book series, I dive more into the world building because it's a more exotic place. But I also still I don't come out and hit you over the head with the gravity of this planet is so many G's compared to Earth. I don't do that. I could do that, and like I said, I've got notes and stuff, but I want it to be about these people and what they're going through and the bonding that happens when you're put in a tight space and everything goes to shit, and I think that's the best world building, is how you work your way out of that. That's my opinion. And I know, I've had people ask for more. They wanted more, and I was like, well, I'd rather leave you with wanting more than wanting less. So
yeah, and so A, you give yourself room to grow within the series.
Yeah.
B, I mean, it's the random facts for me that were in there, like the fact that Foster hates the floors, right? So there's an emotional thing to the world, and the most random fact, which is that the best parties are on Ganymede. For me, it really stuck out. It makes this thing
spring break
real because if you're out there in the middle of nowhere, you want to be in Ganymede partying, but you can't because you're on this
You're
in the
out.
middle of nowhere.
You're out way beyond Ganymede, and it's just kind of boring. And like that's another aspect of the world building is actually the characters' ages because there's no children, right? There's like
Mhm.
much older adults, middle age, and then at the youngest they're like people in their 20s, right? And those are the ones that tend to get the crappy jobs, like down in bottom deck, right? So alongside the bots. But it's there's also a caste system to it, right? Because top deck, mid deck, bottom deck, like the people on the top deck are like the researchers, the white coat people, and then the mid deck is like blue collar, so and mixed with white, and so is and bottom deck is all blue collar. So like that's part of the world building is how it's laid out, and it was
Mhm.
influenced by a factory I worked in college
And,
because I worked in
and
this terrible factory one summer, and it had a top deck, a mid deck, and a bottom deck. And it was flipped though, because like all the scientists and the college students, university students who had parents who were super high up the chain in the science realm of this company, which is a chemical company in my hometown, they all got these cushy jobs, right? Whereas those of us who had mechanics for parents I literally was called Cinderella because I was on my hands and knees wiping up machine oil with my hair all bound
Mhm.
up. And my nickname was Cinderella because I was like constantly covered in like fibers and oil and all this stuff. And like, so I wanted to translate that as part of the world building to Mandara in Heliopods is that you have a caste situation where people are kind of, and it comes back to
I
play later. So,
totally got that because I thought in space there is no up or down,
right,
right? Clearly,
right,
you have created this situation where there is the stratification, even though there is no
yeah,
up or down,
right,
left or right, really.
yeah,
So I found that like really fascinating, and it's those details that really bring a world to life, and it's
right.
those small little things that give us a connection to the world that we are in now, this reality that we understand. And if you can do that, you can build a really fascinating world.
Well, that's what's really fun about your books too. Like I can like see like the fabrics. I can smell this place. I can hear it, I can see it, I can feel myself walking through it and the various detritus of this collapsed future Edinburgh. So I don't you have a particular magic in making that seem incredibly real and incredibly present even though it isn't in the present. You know what I mean? So I love that. Well, so like we talked about how we sort of pigeonhole genre stuff, right? And then it's kind of a more marketing thing. We don't like to put our writing in a box particularly, except for that very practical purpose, of course, that publishers need to put in the metadata, that sort of thing. But I have to wonder, like were there other types of fantasy that influenced you in urban fantasy, or did you always did you ever were you ever interested in sort of like Dungeons and Dragons or like high fantasy with swords, or did you want to just keep it more like sort of a supernatural element from the go?
So this is the weird thing about the Zimbabwean experience. Dungeons and Dragons, we had the cartoon,
I loved the
but
cartoon.
I didn't even know until much later that it was a game,
I didn't
right?
either, to be honest with you. This is what East Tennessee and Zimbabwe have in common.
So you got all this stuff,
Yeah,
He-Man and
yeah.
She-Ra, and there is I forgot the name, but there is this fascinating documentary on Netflix that kind of reveals the origins of these,
It was like the shows that made us, or something like that, or
something like that, and how all they were trying to do was sell toys.
I know it was
So
such a
it
betrayal.
was it was a 20-30 minute advert
I
for
know,
toys.
but I loved it.
But in Zimbabwe, we didn't get the toys, right? So
Yeah,
it became that thing. So a lot of African writers will tell you stuff about oral tradition, listening to stories from my granny, etc. There is that element. I can relate to
yeah.
folktale and stuff like that. But there's television. We were always, and I sincerely believe, like 5 years, maybe a decade behind what was going on everywhere else. used to consume a lot of that. We had one channel that started at 4 p.m. and closed off at about 10 p.m. at night. And then eventually it became a 24-hour channel. But I'm from the time where if you switch the TV on at like 1 p.m., there would be nothing there but static. So you get that influence. The children's books that I was reading, I mean, even when I went to high school, right, the stuff that I was reading, and this is one of the weird things about moving over here, is I quickly realized that, and I always had this sense that I was behind, because a lot of the books that we read, where you choose your own adventure books and that kind of stuff, but these libraries had been stocked for the Rhodesian kids, and they didn't do a great job of updating the books that went in there when we went there. So you were reading stuff, pulp stuff that was like pretty old, your Nancy Drews and your Hardy Boys, etc. So when I came over here, I was like, what? You've got these massive bookshops, and you can just buy any book you want, and they're like relatively cheap. I mean, a book is what? A cup of coffee in Starbucks or something like that. So I started reading, trying to keep up. And one of my greatest regrets is when I was younger and in high school, I didn't bother with the names of the authors, right? It would be a shiny cover if it has a spaceship or something going on there. But later, you know, I remember buying a copy of Vonnegut's Sirens of, is it Titan or something like that?
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I don't remember the exact name.
Yeah. And then reading it and realizing halfway through, I read this in high school. Right? I didn't even know who Vonnegut was. So these things come to you. I mean, like we spoke about earlier, all these influences gradually, they just coalesce into something. But I've been rattling on. I've forgotten what the question was again.
Oh, we were just talking about different genres of fantasy, like, if you would had
the stuff that I was into. I mean, my taste in books have always been eclectic. So, but off the top of my head, there is like your usual stuff, your Tolkien, your C.S. Lewis. It's only later when I came in here that I started really reading more contemporary fiction. Again, starting with the stuff that would pop out at you, your Gaimans and that kind of thing. So Gaiman, your urban fantasy, Neverwhere, still one of my favorite books. But in terms of fantasy, I would read anything across the gamut. I'm actually sort of like just trying to look at my books along the wall to see if anything catches my eye. But it's a weird sort of like education in the subject.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating though how we sort of came at this, and I grew up in the country, and like my big event was if my dad would take me to the town, to the library, and then I would just grab everything I could because the country didn't have a library, right? So, and a lot of those books were not the most up to date, but the library system did manage, despite really not having the emphasis from that town on that sort of thing. It actually had a pretty good selection for what it was. And so, I kind of felt lucky, but at the same time, like, because we grew up in similar eras, like I felt like I was missing out on a lot of stuff by being, from East Tennessee and not really able to keep up with society as well until the internet came along in the 90s, right? And that's when everything sort of just exploded, and I was able to, and I visited San Francisco for the first time, and it changed my entire life, like thinking that there's this whole universe out there I didn't know was there in these huge bookstores like you mentioned. And I was like, this is paradise, like university kind of prepared me for it, but then travel really hammered that home, that there was more to the universe than at my back door. So it's kind of interesting.
And you've touched on something really, really important, which is the role of libraries. Here in the UK, with the Tory government that's there now, they've been slashing funding. Libraries have been
Yeah, I know.
closing down. But
I hate
these
that.
spaces, nothing beats a good, well-stocked library for a young
Yeah.
person. Yeah.
Amen. Like I just said, it can change your whole life, and it became too. When COVID shut down a lot of the libraries, I felt like that was a major loss. But I'm glad that they're back, right? But I feel we can't understate how important libraries are to young readers, especially, and to people who in the community who that is their social network. Is the library. So
Yeah, and they connect you to stuff like now, cause we're speaking. When I was up till now, I have a fascination with Greek mythology. And
ah
this is because of this book called Men and Gods by Rex Warner, that I picked up from my high school library. So, but Greek mythology leads you naturally into a fascination with astronomy
yeah,
and science, right? Because all the
yes,
planets are named after the gods. It might be sort of like the Roman variants of the names,
right,
but by the time you've been reading that stuff as a kid, you know all this, and you see these connections. There's a particular book that we got. It must have been American because there's the legend of John Henry. All right, who's this guy? I don't know if you've heard the story. At the time, they were bringing in steam machines for digging or something,
yeah,
and it was John Henry and his hammers against the machine,
yeah.
and he won against the machine and died. But then later on, Terminator fan here,
Mm-hmm.
what the Sarah Connor Chronicles, you
Yep.
could then link it to one of the machines was called John Henry. And you're like, oh, that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
So all the stuff, but you don't have that without that foundation of getting books from a good library.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
with your appreciation of Greek mythology, you're going to appreciate ephemeris very much, I think. So, because I play with that a little bit, I want to know if you pick up all the many connections there, because that was powerfully influential on me too. My dad, I have somewhere, yeah, there's a really ancient book on mythology. Gosh, I think it's from the 30s. I'm not sure. The 1930s, since the 2030s aren't here, but they almost are. Anyway, so like that was, I would just pour through that book and astronomy books as a kid with him, and then kind of ran with that. But and then I also almost minored in classics, and I studied, ancient Greek and Roman mythology and
Fantastic.
architecture, and I took Latin, and I translated the freaking Aeneid, So it was like I feel like we can't understate how much influence that has on our current mythologies that we are building from scratch, but also, and then too, like the thing about America is that it's a land of tall tales. I know you're shocked, but so that's very much like I grew up in East Tennessee, which is like the land of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, and there's like songs and all this like this sort of hickory whip wisdom, as I like to call it, and just everything is larger than life because America was larger than we could comprehend. So we had to cope
Mhm.
with it somehow. I mean, it's just immense. It's huge, like. So it's funny how we build these things to help us kind of cope in our worlds. So, but getting back to your writing, I would love to know. So there's a sequel to Library of the Dead,
There
and
is
you're
Our
working
Lady of
on
Mysterious Ailments.
Our Lady of Mysterious Elements. Fabulous title. Your titles are magnificent. And then working on a third in the
The
series.
Mystery at Dunvegan Castle.
Yes. Woo! I can see it. I love it. And when
Yeah.
can we get
So
that in our paws?
the next time you come back to Scotland,
Which I need to soon.
you you have to go to the Isle of Skye.
Yes, I do.
You visit the Highlands. Isle of Skye. It's this weird place because I first visited it. I was doing this job as a removals man, moving people
Oh wow.
houses, and it was a great gig because for the first time, I was traveling we work nationwide, right?
Okay.
And so we're traveling to these villages and these far out places that you would have no reason to visit. And I had this job in autumn that took us from somewhere outside of Manchester, and I forgot the name of this little place, to the Isle of Skye. Those wonderful autumn colors.
Awesome.
And we crossed, there's a bridge from the mainland onto the Isle of Skye. And it was like, okay, this is what Mars would look like if Mars had life on it, because
Awesome.
hardly any trees there, but it's a fantastic ecosystem, and just the colors, I was haunted. I didn't know at the time that I would write something that was set in that particular location. So the first two books are set in Edinburgh. The third book, which will come out next year in June, if I've got my dates correct.
Okay.
I wanted it, Ropa moves a lot around the city of Edinburgh. So I thought, okay, I want to bring her into country house mystery where everything happens in one location, one building. So it's set in Dunvegan Castle, which is the seat of the MacLeod clan.
Oh
MacLeod's Highlanders.
Yep. Oh man, I'm a big Highlander fan, which, I mean, you probably figured that out. So that's awesome.
Exactly.
Is it going to be are there going to be kind of like gothic horror elements? Because you got like big spooky house thing going on, right? Woo!
There is a horror-ish stuff, but the setting for the third one is it's the Society of Skeptical Inquirers, the Scottish magicians, have an annual conference that's kind of academic-y and businessy, where they exchange ideas and stuff. And if ever you've been in academia, you've been to one of these conferences before, and you know how they can be a bit sort of like, I don't know, pedantic, pretentious, and all that.
Yeah, but
so you take that. But still, you've got really fascinating things. So that way, I was able, to come up. Now I've got Marxist magicians in the mix and weird stuff like that. But there is a murder, and Ropa has to find who done it in order to save Scottish magic.
Oh, I love it. That's fantastic. Well, these are all great things to look forward to, but I would love to know, I'm going to start wrapping it up, but I'll do a couple more questions. And one of them is, what's the worst writing advice you've ever received?
Oh, worst writing advice. Oh yeah, I am. This is a weird incident. So after I'd done my first novel, which is set primarily in a hairdressing salon, the Hairdresser of Harare.
Yeah.
It did pretty well with independent publishers, and I'd done my second book, and I had a meeting with my publisher, Freight. They're now defunct, so I can talk about this openly. And it was a meeting. Little did I know that I'd been called to lunch to eat this expensive salmon for them to reject my second book. And my publisher then said to me, look, Tendai, readers will only give you a certain range. We've done very well with The Hairdresser of Harare. I think we should build on that. Maybe do a sequel or something similar, but don't go too far outside of that. If I had listened to that advice, and I get the advice, right? It's author branding. So if I pick up a John Grisham novel, I would be very disappointed if it turns out to be a space opera, right? Because I know what I'm getting. Yeah. So I get that in terms of how the industry works. But if I had listened to that advice, there wouldn't be the Library of the Dead.
Yeah.
There you go. So go as the spirit moves you. But having said that, you should also have an understanding that the way I look at it, it is art when it's me here in my flat, flirting away on my laptop. But I also understand and respect that there is a commercial dimension to that as soon as I send it out there to my publishers and stuff, it is business. And so that is something that I've been trying to navigate over time without losing my soul in the process.
And that's a tricky navigation and one I'm currently experiencing. I mean, there's a business side to publishing, and we like to get wrapped up in what we want to write, but we also have to be pragmatic. We also have to pay the bills, you know. So there's that. But I love that you stuck to doing what you wanted to do. And so from that, what would you say is the best advice that you could give writers starting out?
Best advice was it, weirdly enough, it's my best friend Tino Mandaza. Now he's not a reader. He doesn't read my work, and it keeps me grounded. I love that about him. And there was a time, you know, before I got published, we were actually like, we lived together for a while, and I was like getting rejections. Nothing. Have you ever had that period in your life where nothing you do
Nothing's
lands?
going their way. Yep.
And yeah, and I'm like, you know, I said to him, yeah, I'm done with this. And he was looking
those very words. Yep.
And he was looking at my book collection, and he was just grabbing my books, you know, checking one here, checking the other there. And he said to me, look, these authors that you idolize, they're just people like you. You know, you're not any different from them. If you meet them, you probably think they're not all that. It was very good advice at the time. You know, it took me a while to get what he was trying to say to me, because much later on, when I became published, I'd never been to literary festivals or anything like that until I actually got published. But when you start meeting some of your idols, you're like, oh, I was expecting something, I don't know, someone a bit taller, someone a bit more spectacular. And
There's huge mysticism about them, and it's totally like, no, they're just eating. Oh.
Yeah, it's just people. But that, I think it puts it into perspective that anyone who, you know, if you're doing this, having met a lot of people along the way, the ones that end up getting published aren't necessarily the best. It's just the ones that stick to it, and they become the best versions of themselves that they could be. Perseverance.
Yes, it's the perseverance. Yes, that's perfect. Outstanding. Well, is there anything that I haven't asked that you'd like to say before we call it a day or a night for
you? You've covered like a lot, but there is something that you touched on that maybe I want to ask you.
Okay.
Because I know you have this fascination. You know, you're working, if you hold up the cover for Ephemeris,
yeah.
Ephemeris, sorry, which is a castle on an asteroid. So I'll ask you, genre bending works like that, your approach to creating these things that borrow sort of like from fantasy, from SFF, and actually wielding them into something that works from a technical viewpoint. How do you do that?
I think I just kind of look around and I think about, you know, you were talking about your father's experience and how things had changed from when he was a child. And the same kind of thing happened to my father, where he was born in the 1930s. He grew up in Great Depression, out in the middle of nowhere, East Tennessee, and went barefoot to school, you know, and had to go get buckets of water and things like that. He was in the poorest county in one of the poorest states in America. And we have...
You're my sister from another father.
I know. Sister from another mister. So, you know, and we have Scots-Irish background, ancestry too. So I feel like I kind of would think, what was it like for Dad to go from that to having iPhones? You know, if you think about that, that's science fiction fantasy. Like he saw.
That's crazy.
Right? Isn't it crazy? Because, and then he watched Star Trek. When he saw Star Wars, which was the first movie I remember seeing in the theater, and you can tell It's definitely influenced me. But like he experienced that wonder. He saw, we saw a man land on the moon, in his lifetime. So he goes from hauling buckets of water, to that. And I know that he had a lot of pride seeing that unfold in his lifetime. And so I kind of approach things like, like I grew up in the country, and yet all these fantastic things were happening. Like I was watching Aliens with The Thing, and like I kind of feel like there's mundane and then there's fantastical, and I like to see where they kind of slope and slide and fit together. And you need not look any further than what our parents went through, and probably what we've gone through, because we straddled, sort of the analog and digital era in Gen X, and that sort of thing. So I like the blending just being sort of matter of fact. That I don't like to kind of put the lens on it too long for you to look too hard at it. So when I play with the fantasy, even though you could say that magic is just technology we haven't discovered yet, well, yeah, sure it is actually. Even if I don't spell it out, I mean, an iPhone would have been magic to Dad as a kid, right?
Yeah.
It would have been the ultimate in fantasy and science fiction. Whereas like there's a lot we don't know what we don't know. And I have a science background, but I feel comfortable saying that we're going to find in the next 5, 10, 15 years the most exotic, crazy stuff out in the galaxy and within our oceans and in our cells that we just could not have fathomed when you and I were kids. It's going to seem like fantasy. It's going to seem like the most outrageous, crazy thing. And so I like to play with that sort of loosening around the edges, because I already know that some of the stuff that we write speculating the future is probably going to be discovered and instantly date what we write. So I like to keep it a little more fantastical, and I like to push the timeline out a bit. Like Blade Runner was 2019. So, I just kind of I like to push things out and blend them together at the same time. I don't really have a really good description for how I do it, but that's how I do it. I think about where Dad came from, where I came from, and I try to think from a science perspective, where are we going to be and what could help us, and then also just trying to. I remember somebody asked me one time about Heliopause and about the series, and they said, and this is pre-pandemic, mind you, because it came out in 2018, and they said, are we still here in the future? It's a pretty serious question to ask. And I said, yes, we are. And, I feel certain that at least hundreds of years from now, we will be here, although we might not recognize what form we're starting to take, and how AI and Internet of Things plays into that and all that sort of stuff. So, but that's just it. I don't know.
No, I totally get that. I think what you and me are trying to create is a sense of wonder.
Yes, exactly.
That's
Boom.
what we're doing. Yeah.
Tendai, this has been fantastic. I've just so much enjoyed this. So everybody run out, don't walk, grab the Library of the Dead, and thank you. So, and I hope that we can see each other at more festivals and talk more about all kinds of books and things. So this was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.